God's people said, yeah, go ahead and be seated. Let me just say good morning to you, Trinity Church family, and a special guest. To you special guests, we're glad to have you here with us as we are continuing on in our series, Exiles in Babylon, as we are walking through the book of Daniel together. Before we get into Daniel 3, though, let me ask you a question. What would you do if the government threatened to kill you if you didn't participate in one of its government-sponsored initiatives, which meant you had to disobey God? The reason that I asked that question is because that was the precise situation for three young men who lived in Babylon in the 6th century BC under the totalitarian regime of King Nebuchadnezzar. This story that we've been looking at over the last few weeks, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king. He's the one in charge, and he's going to issue this government-sponsored initiative. Daniel 3 opens with this king having just built a 10-story statue of himself and demanding that everyone in the empire bow down to that statue or else be executed. Take a look at verse 1 as we look at this story together. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. Verse 4, then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Now, let me just give some context here. King Nebuchadnezzar's self-exalting, God-defying executive order, right? This command to bow down to an image of himself. If you've been around for this series, if specifically you were here last week, you're reading this and you're thinking, this doesn't make any sense. Right? At the end of the message last week, at the end of Daniel 2 last week, we see King Nebuchadnezzar giving God praise, giving God honor, giving God glory for having miraculously revealed himself to Nebuchadnezzar through that dream. Remember how Daniel 2 comes to a conclusion. In verse 47, this is King Nebuchadnezzar speaking. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. Right, that's a pretty powerful declaration of faith. Right? It's not exactly like the song we sang, This I Believe, where we just rehearsed the Apostles' Creed. So I'm not saying that this is a confession of saving faith, but it's certainly evidence that King Nebuchadnezzar had experienced something of the reality of the rule and reign of God. That's how chapter 2 ends. Chapter 3 begins with him building this tower of himself, 90 feet high, and telling everyone to bow down and worship. Right? 9 years later, and this is an important time frame. It's an important thing to understand that between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, there are 9 years. That's the gap in time. And between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, these 9 years, somewhere along the way, King Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten what God did for him and what God revealed to him in that dream, as evidenced by the fact that Nebuchadnezzar here is slipping back into his self-centered, self-exalting ways. Now, before I take too many shots at King Nebuchadnezzar for doing this, let me confess my own tendency to do this kind of thing. And by that, I don't mean building a statue of myself on the Trinity campus. That's not in the plans, and if it ever is, you should fire me, find a new senior pastor. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, here's the point of my confession. I want to confess my tendency to, like Nebuchadnezzar, forget at times what God has done for me and what God has revealed to me. See, like King Nebuchadnezzar, there have been times in my walk with God when God has done something for me or revealed something to me, and I've thought to myself, I'm never going to let the memory of this lesson fade. I'm never going to let this experience fade. And then, in a period of time, often less than 9 years, I find myself letting that memory fade. I find myself letting that memory fade. Maybe you can relate to that. Well, 9 years earlier, God had revealed to Nebuchadnezzar that the Babylonian Empire over which he was king was a temporary empire, was a temporary kingdom. God revealed to Nebuchadnezzar that there was this day coming when his kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom, and every kingdom on earth for that matter, that every one of these kingdoms ruled by man would one day give way to the kingdom of heaven, a kingdom that would last forever. And for a while, that truth, that revelation impacted the way that Nebuchadnezzar ruled. As we saw at the end of chapter 2, with this greater sense of humility, with the sense of the temporary nature of his own kingdom reign. But then somewhere along the way, we don't know exactly when in those next 9 years it happened, but somewhere along the way, Nebuchadnezzar slips back into thinking that the reason that he's in charge of this Babylonian empire is not because God has allowed him to rule this empire, but because he is awesome. I mean, that's in a succinct kind of way that he just thinks he's awesome. This is pure arrogance. It's pure foolishness. Sort of like the guy who's standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, who looks out on its beauty and its grandeur and then declares from the edge of that Grand Canyon, I am awesome. I've been to the Grand Canyon a few times. I've stood beside lots of people who are looking out at that very scene that you see on screen. Never once have I ever heard anyone standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon declare, I am awesome. It would be ridiculous, right? And yet that's King Nebuchadnezzar, who has forgotten what God revealed to him at the end of chapter 2. That he, God, is King of kings. That he, God, is Lord of lords. That he, God, is awesome, not Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, as Alistair Begg explains, Nebuchadnezzar hasn't just forgotten his dream, he's forgotten his history. This is really important. Nebuchadnezzar hasn't just forgotten his dream, he's forgotten his history. See, Nebuchadnezzar here is setting up this 10-story statue of himself on the very plain where his Babylonian ancestors had set up the Tower of Babel, which was the original Babylon, or as the kids say, the OG Babylon, the 1.0, right? The first Babylon. We even have in that word Babylon, Babel. Verse 1 tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar sets up a 10-story statue on the plain of Dura, which is another name for the plain of Shinar, which was the very location of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. King Nebuchadnezzar, it says in verse 1, made an image of gold, 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. The Tower of Babel, Babylon 1.0, was also built on the plain of Dura, which is where the first human civilization rebelled against God. It's where the first human society, if you will, disobeyed God in a very systemic way. They disobeyed God's call to spread out over the whole earth. That's what the command was in Genesis 1 and 2. Spread out over the whole earth. Have dominion over the whole earth. Tower of Babel, first human society, they say, no, we're gonna stay right here, and then we're also going to do something else. On this plain of Dura, they're going to build a tower to the heavens. And this was not just like this architectural, boy, this could be cool if we could build something. No, this piece of architecture had a very specific purpose behind it. The reason that they built this tower to the heavens, Genesis 11 tells us, is why? It was so that they might make a great name for themselves. That was the intent. That was the objective. That was the goal, to make a great name for themselves. In other words, the Tower of Babel was a pride project through and through. A pride project through and through. God, though, if you know the story, thwarted their pride project by mixing up their languages. That's why we even have that word, they're babbling. We can't understand what they're saying. God mixes up their languages so that they can't understand each other. They couldn't understand each other, which then led them to scatter over the face of the earth, thereby stripping them, stopping them, halting them from carrying out their self-exalting pride project. Fast forward 1,000 years or so, and Babylon is back. Specifically, Babylon is back because King Nebuchadnezzar has succeeded in making Babylon great again. With pride, again, being the very marker of this empire. As King Nebuchadnezzar, on this very same plain of Dura, builds a statue of himself to the sky and then demands that everyone in Babylon bow down to it. Again, Nebuchadnezzar has not just forgotten his dream, folks. He has forgotten his history as he sets up this God-defying, self-exalting statue on the very plain where his Babylonian ancestors had set up the Tower of Babel. See, those who fail to learn their history are bound to repeat it. And Nebuchadnezzar here is about to repeat a history lesson that God was trying to teach his ancestors some 1,000 years earlier. but not before Nebuchadnezzar doubles down and issues this command with significant consequences if not obeyed. Take a look at verse 6. You'll see what I mean. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar here is not just rolling out one of those government initiatives that the people could participate in or not. No, if the people don't participate in this government-sponsored initiative, they won't just be canceled, they'll be killed. And so, not surprisingly, the participation rate in this new government initiative is very high. Take a look at verse 7. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every nation fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. All the peoples, all the nations. I mean, that's just universal language here to describe who's participating in this government-sponsored initiative. Now, maybe everyone bowed down because they were so in awe of this epic statue. I doubt it. I really doubt it. More likely, I think, everyone bowed down because everyone else was bowing down. Because everyone else was bowing down. See, people are sheep. There is a reason that the animal most often used to describe human beings in the Bible is a sheep. Sheep are not what we would deem an intelligent animal. Sheep are always getting lost. And not only are they getting lost, they're so often getting lost following other lost sheep. In fact, years ago, a sheep fell off a cliff in the Middle East, and 1,500 other sheep followed that sheep off the cliff. 450 of them died. The other 1,050 sheep, they survived by landing on the soft pile of dead sheep. Now, this is why the prophet Isaiah would say things like, all we like sheep have gone astray. It's not the animal that you want to be associated with. It's not the animal of pride. All we like sheep have gone astray. I know it might be easy to snicker at how so many people here in this story are bowing down to this statue like sheep. But let me just be clear here. There are places in our culture too where peer pressure and groupthink is leading many, including Christians, to follow the crowd, especially around the subjects of sexuality and self, and especially given the cost for those who don't go along with the crowd. So I say that because I don't want us to underestimate the way that groupthink can turn all of us into sheep. The studies are really pretty clear. Studies are showing more and more that people are far more susceptible to peer pressure than we think. In fact, there was a study done years ago by a psychologist by the name of Ruth Berenda with teenagers that was designed to show how powerful, how compelling is peer pressure. Chuck Swindoll described the study. He writes this. He says, the plan was simple. They brought groups of 10 adolescents into a room for a test. Each group of 10 was instructed to raise their hands when the teacher pointed to the longest line on a chart, like this one that you see on screen. Very simple experiment, right? Just like which is the longest line out of the 3 lines. What one person in the group did not know was that 9 of the other students in the room had been instructed ahead of time to vote for the second longest line. Regardless of the instructions, once they were all together in the room, those 9 were not to vote for the longest line, but rather vote for the next to the longest line. The goal was to determine how one person reacted when completely surrounded by a large number of people who stood against what was clearly true. The experiment began when 9 teenagers voted for the wrong line. The 10th person typically would glance around, frown in confusion, and then slip his hand up with the group. These instructions were repeated, and the next card was raised. Time after time after time, the 10th person would sit there saying, a short line is longer than a long line, simply because he lacked the courage and conviction to challenge the group. This remarkable conformity occurred in about 75% of the cases, and was true of both small children and high school students. Now, let me be clear here. My point here is not to diss on teenagers. I'm looking out, I'm seeing a lot of teenagers. That is not my point. My point is not to diss on teenagers. Peer pressure is not a team temptation exclusively. All right? Peer pressure, groupthink is a reality that affects the entire human race. Every one of us is susceptible to what I'm describing here. In fact, Proverbs 29:25, it says this, the fear of man will prove to be a snare. That was a verse that wasn't just written to teenagers. It was written to the human race. It was written to human beings. The fear of man will prove to be a snare. In other words, nobody is beyond this temptation of getting caught in the snare of people-pleasing. Which is why it wasn't just Babylonians. This is really important. It wasn't just Babylonians who were bowing down to that 90-foot statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. No, according to verse 7, there were also Jews bowing down, even though they knew the statue wasn't God. I mean, it says all peoples, all nations. I mean, it's universal language, so that includes the Jewish people. You might be thinking, well, why would they do that? Well, because it's not easy to stand up when everybody else is bowing down. And that's true, not just in ancient Babylon, that's true today in our culture too. See, you and I may not be tempted to bow down to a 90-foot statue of Nebuchadnezzar. Right? I mean, I've been here 4 years now. Not once have I, in driving around South Bend, ever seen one northern Indianan bowing down to a 90-foot statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. Not even once. Right? So we might not be bowing down to a 90-foot statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, but there are other things that we are tempted to idolize and bow down to. Idols like comfort, security, family, political candidates, sports teams, maybe a relational dream that we have for our lives, our vocation, our reputation, the affirmation of other people, sexual gratification. And you could probably list a bunch more of these things that we can tend to idolize, these things that we can set above God, these things that become non-negotiables in our lives. My point is this: idolatry was not just a problem in Babylon, it's a problem that marks all human societies because it's a problem that marks all human hearts. Romans 1 gives an accurate commentary on the human race when the Apostle Paul says this: although they knew God, he's speaking about the human race, although they, that's us, knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man. They worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And we've all done this. We've all exalted the creature in different ways above the Creator, because idolatry is this universal phenomenon. Yes, idols change from generation to generation. Idols change. Like I said, I've never seen anyone in South Bend, at least in the 4 years that I've been here, ever worshiping a 90-foot statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. But that doesn't mean there aren't still things that we are tempted to idolize and bow down to. Whether it be comfort, security, family, like I said, political candidates, relational dreams, our vocation, our reputation, the affirmation of other people. And the truth is, being a Christian does not make us immune to idolatry. This is a really important point. Being a Christian does not make us immune to idolatry. Alistair Begg says it this way: a Christian is not someone who never struggles with idol worship, but someone who prays this. I love this prayer. Lord, the dearest idol I have known, whatever that idol may be, help me to tear it from its throne and worship only thee. Again, you and I are never going to be totally free from the temptation to idolatry until Jesus returns and sets this broken world, including our hearts, which are also broken, to rights. That's what Jesus is going to do. He's going to set this broken world to rights. And part of that broken world includes our hearts. Until then, we need God to help us have the courage and the insight to identify those things that we are tempted to idolize and bow down to, so that we can then pray this prayer: Lord, the dearest idol I have known, whatever idol it may be, help me to tear it from its throne and worship only thee. Of course, nobody on the plain of Dura was praying that prayer except for three young men. Three young men: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're going to see them here in just a moment. These three young men, because they refused to bow down, they then become public enemy number one, not only in the eyes of King Nebuchadnezzar, but in the eyes of his palace staff. You saw at the beginning of this chapter, like, everyone's there: House of Representatives, senators, so, the justices. I mean, everyone's there. He's got it. The whole crew. Everyone is there. These three guys become public enemy number one of his palace staff. in particular, one group of his palace staff. Look at verses 8 and following, you'll see this. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three Jews who are now living as exiles in Babylon, they refused to go along with the crowd that was bowing down to this statue, which infuriates King Nebuchadnezzar and his palace officials, and this then leads them to take up an offense on behalf of King Nebuchadnezzar. These are his cronies, right? These are his sycophant suck-ups, these political opportunists who are using this as an opportunity to not only stick it to the Jews, but also show King Nebuchadnezzar how loyal they are to him. According to verse 12, these political opportunists, they pounce on these three Jews and they call them out for not participating in Nebuchadnezzar's government-sponsored initiative. To this, I would say these guys sort of remind me of those today who are using the cultural winds of change to pick fights with believers. Like the pseudo-Satanist group in Iowa that recently used a religious liberty policy to set up a shrine to Satan in the Iowa Capitol building. Not because they actually believe in Satan, they were clear that they didn't, but simply as a way, by their own admission, to stick it to Christians. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's astrologers, they're using this government-sponsored initiative as well as this opportunity to stick it to these Jews, which then sets up this battle between these three Jews who refuse to obey the political policy of King Nebuchadnezzar and the king himself, who, as you can imagine, is not happy when he finds out that these guys are disregarding his initiative. Take a look at verses 13 and following. You'll see what I mean. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Verse 13 makes it clear Nebuchadnezzar is furious with rage, which you might think would lead him to just kill these three dudes, right? Because we have already seen, Nebuchadnezzar, we know from history, it's not like he couldn't kill people. His military exploits were significant. So why didn't he just kill these guys? He could have just killed them. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want to kill these guys. Nebuchadnezzar wants to compel them to do what he tells them. He wants to compel them to do what he tells them. He wants them to renounce their religion and submit to the state. And to ensure that these three men submit to him, Nebuchadnezzar does what totalitarian regimes do when someone's religion gets in the way of them submitting to the state. He threatens to kill them. He threatens to kill them. And so now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're at this crossroads. They're at this fork in the road. Do they stay faithful to God and risk being executed? Or do they just, real quick, with fingers crossed behind their backs, just bow down to the statue and get on with life? Alistair Begg writes this. He says, "What's the problem with just once bowing down? It's not an actual God. Plus, if you bow down, you won't die. And then you can be useful to God. And God wants us to be useful to him, right? So just bow down real fast and get on with living." Well, that's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do. Take a look at verse 16. You'll see their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego basically say, do your worst, Nebuchadnezzar. Do your worst, because we serve a God who is more than able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. Of course, I say that, and in the same breath, I want to make sure that I highlight, it's so important to note that these three guys' refusal to bow down is not conditioned upon God delivering them from death. It's not conditioned upon God delivering them from death. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they have decided to not bow down to this idol, even if God doesn't deliver them from the fiery furnace. Notice this in verse 18. But, they continue, even if God does not, we want you to know, your majesty, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. I love this story for so many reasons, but in part because it inspires me to trust that God really can rescue us from any and every fiery furnace situation that we might find ourselves in. But it also reminds me that even if God doesn't rescue me from whatever situation I might find myself in, I still want to trust him like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to endure whatever consequences come my way because I've trusted him. See, as you've heard me say before, whenever I'm in the middle of a trial, whenever I'm going through something really difficult, and there have been a few of those challenges that I have been walking through over the last couple of years, whenever I'm in the middle of that, I always begin by asking God to rescue me from it. I don't try to be more spiritual than the people in the Bible who, when they find themselves in a pickle, ask for God to rescue them out of it, to deliver them out of that situation. So I always begin by asking God to rescue me from it. I just don't want to stop there. I don't want to stop there if I continue to be in that situation. I don't want to stop there if God doesn't rescue me from that situation. See, the story in Daniel 3 reminds me that even if God doesn't rescue me from the fiery furnace, God can and will strengthen me to endure through the fiery furnace. It's both, right? And this story just gives us this beautiful picture of both. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Our God is able to deliver us. Do your worst, King Nebuchadnezzar. But even if he doesn't, we're not bowing down. Even if he doesn't, we're not going to commit ourselves to these false gods. These three young men, they didn't know which way God would provide for them, whether he would rescue them from or help them endure through, which, like I said, is what makes this story such a beautiful picture of faith, such a beautiful example of what it looks like to trust God, regardless of whether or not God comes through for us in the way we want him to come through for us. Sadly, a lot of believers today fall prey to what I call conditional Christianity. If you're following along in your notes, it's something I call conditional Christianity, which is essentially a negotiated contract where we trust and obey God as long as God meets certain conditions. So, for example, as long as God meets the conditions of what I want financially, I'll trust and obey him. As long as God meets the conditions of what I want vocationally, I'll trust and obey him. As long as God meets the conditions of what I want relationally, I'll trust and obey him. As long as God meets the conditions of what I want emotionally, I'll trust and obey him. As long as God meets the conditions of what I want physically, I'll trust and obey him. As long as God meets the conditions of what I want romantically, I'll trust and obey him. As long as God meets the conditions of what I want sexually, I'll trust and obey him. And you can continue on. I mean, this is, you might even have your own ways that you would fill that out. Conditional Christianity. Now, let me be clear. Most of us are not so crass as to actually write out a contract where we would say it that bluntly. It's usually much more subconscious, but it's in our hearts for many of us. Many of us, we sort of subscribe to this conditional Christianity where we will obey God as long as he does fill in the blank. And then when he doesn't, we're either withholding obedience or we're waiting for him to come through in some way before we're going to go all in. We have this conditional Christianity. Well, the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is not conditional. They trust God despite the consequences, even when it leads to being thrown into a Babylonian furnace. which could be heated up as hot as 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is exactly what happens next. Take a look at verses 19 and 20. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. The furnace is so hot, by the way, we're going to see this in the rest of the story. The soldiers who take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the furnace, they themselves, they get burned up because they're just close enough to this fire as they're trying to drop these 3 Jewish dudes in the fire. They die. Take a look at verse 21. You'll see this. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, in other words, flammable material, right, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace, which should be the end of the story for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And yet in the very next verse, King Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to see this, he jumps to his feet because he sees someone else in that fire besides these 3 young men. In the fire with these 3 young men. Take a look at verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. See, before King Nebuchadnezzar says what he sees, he first wants to confirm the number of guys he throws into the furnace. Right? Like, there were 3 guys that we threw into this fire, right? To which his advisors are like, yeah, there were 3 guys. Then who's the other guy in the furnace? Nebuchadnezzar asks. Look at verse 25. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Now, there's some debate about the identity of this 4th person in the fire. Some people believe it's an angel. Some people believe it's the angel of the Lord. Some people believe it's the pre-incarnate Jesus. I don't want to get into a debate about this particular point and miss the big idea, which is this. The 4th person in the fire is either the Lord or an emissary of the Lord who serves to answer King Nebuchadnezzar's rhetorical question that he asks, who is the God who will rescue you out of my hands? Remember, that's what he says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at the end of this little conversation. Who's going to rescue you out of my hands? It's the ultimate flex. King Nebuchadnezzar is flexing. You've got a God. Look, I'm the God. I'm in charge of this kingdom. So you go ahead and pray to your God. You think he's going to deliver you out of my hand? This scene right here, it's answering that question. Who's the God who's going to deliver you out of my hand? Here's the answer to Nebuchadnezzar's question. The Lord is the one who will deliver his people. Because delivering his people is one of the things the Lord always does. The Lord delivered his people out of slavery to the Egyptians through Moses. The Lord delivered his people from their slavery to the Philistines through David. 600 years after this story, the Lord would deliver his people from their slavery to sin through Jesus, which is the story that we get in on. In fact, this Daniel 3 scene of another in the fire really is a foreshadow of the gospel. It's a preview of that ultimate deliverance from sin and death that would come one day through Jesus. The one who entered into the fiery furnace of God's judgment for us. And that preposition for us is really important. I'm trying to distinguish it from with us. Jesus entered into the fiery furnace of God's judgment for us. Whereas this 4th figure in the Daniel 3 story, right, he's in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In Jesus, we have one who entered into the fiery furnace of God's judgment for us. Not just with us. As if we could in some way take on the consequences for sin and not be eternally condemned. No, that's why Jesus went into the fiery furnace of God's judgment for us. It's the only way we get through. It wasn't just a with us, it was for us. Jesus endured the judgment of hell for us so that you and I wouldn't have to. Which is why the next step I want to invite you to consider if you're not yet a Christian this morning is this, to put your trust in Jesus. This one who entered into the fiery furnace of God's judgment for you. This Jesus who died in your place to deliver you from the punishment of sin and to make you right with God, to adopt you into his family, to make you an heir in his coming kingdom. And you can do that right now, right where you are, by simply turning to and trusting Jesus, this one who loved you so much that he was willing to walk into the furnace of God's judgment for you. Now, for those of you who have already taken this step, you've already put your trust in Jesus, you've already been delivered from the fire furnace of hell in the next life. That does not mean that you won't face fire furnace trials in this life. And so a next step for those of us who are already believers is to trust God to be with us in the fiery furnace of whatever trial we're in right now. And to not buy the lie that following Jesus will always lead to lollipops and rainbows in this life. Because it won't. That's not true. In fact, sometimes faithfully following Jesus will lead us right into a fiery furnace. I mean, sometimes there's just a straight line between faithfully following Jesus and it leading straight into a fiery furnace. But since God is with us in the fire, those flames, they may hurt our flesh, they may hurt our feelings, but they won't singe our souls. They won't singe our souls. Those flames now will only serve God's purpose of refining us for the coming glory. Refining us for the eternal kingdom that's coming. In the words of that great hymn, how firm a foundation, when through fiery trials thy pathways shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. See, with God with us in the fire furnace, those flames can no longer singe our souls. Their only purpose now is to refine us. Their only purpose now is to burn off the dross of self and sin so that we look more like him. This is why Peter, who undoubtedly had this story from Daniel 3 in mind, he wrote this in 1 Peter 4 to some of his fellow believers, some brothers and sisters in Christ who were enduring significant suffering. Listen to what Peter says in 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Now, I know you read some verses like that, and it's like, man, is Peter really that cold-hearted? Is he really that unsympathetic toward those who are experiencing suffering, calling them to rejoice? It just, for some of us, it just doesn't register. It doesn't seem kind. And I think sometimes we fall into thinking this way because we've got this very distorted view of Jesus in our minds as this cosmic sky fairy whose job is to sprinkle feel-good pixie dust on us and to protect us from bad things ever happening to us. But friends, if you're like me and you've read through this book, you know this. Jesus never promises us a life where bad things won't happen to us. What Jesus promises us is a life where we can be free of the paralyzing fear of bad things ever happening to us. Because he's already endured the worst fire for us, and he's now in the fire with us. Knowing those two realities, that he's already endured the fire for us, fire of God's judgment, and that he's in the fire with us, the temporal suffering, knowing those two realities, it changes the way that we understand this life. Which is why then we can look squarely into the face of whatever temporal suffering comes our way. Loneliness, pain of any kind, financial loss, relational heartache, people not liking us, failure, even impending death. We can look into the face of all of that, and we can face all of those things with hope, with peace, with joy, because we know that Jesus has already walked through the eternal fire for us, and that Jesus is now in the temporal fire with us. So that, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we too can proclaim, our God can deliver us. Our God is more than able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, O King, we're not bowing down to any idol, even if it leads to some fiery furnace. And let me be clear, friends, there will likely be times when refusing to bow down to one of today's Babylonian idols or one of today's Babylonian ideologies, it will lead to some kind of fiery furnace. For example, refusing to, quote, follow my heart or be true to myself may lead to a season of dissatisfaction. You want to talk about Babylonian ideology? Be true to yourself. Right? You be you. Follow your heart. These are Babylonian ideologies. Refusing to bow down to that may lead to a season of dissatisfaction. Refusing to affirm today's sexual ethics may lead to job loss or people thinking that we're bigots or haters or worse. Refusing to bow down to the idol of materialism by choosing to be generous with the money that God entrusts to us. It might mean missing out on certain pleasures and treasures that we could enjoy if we weren't going to be generous with it. Refusing to bow down to the idol of romance by not settling for someone who doesn't love God might mean missing out on our dream of marriage. Refusing to bow down to the idol of approval, people's affirmation by professing some of Scripture's most unpopular teachings. That might mean that our reputation in the eyes of some people takes a hit. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other Babylonian idols and ideologies that I could have thrown out there. My point is this. This is all part of our discipleship. Right? I mean, this is part of what it means to follow Jesus. Jesus didn't bury this in the fine print. I mean, he just laid this out there. If you want to follow me, take up your cross. And then so that we wouldn't have this victim spirit about it, he said, oh, but what you're going to get in return, 10,000% interest. Kingdom, glorious kingdom, restored creation, reunion. But he was very clear, if you want to follow me, take up your cross. This is part of our discipleship, friends. This is part of what it means to follow Jesus. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we need to be willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace for the sake of staying faithful to God. And so my encouragement, let's trust God to deliver us from the fiery furnace or to help us endure through the fiery furnace. Either way, what I'm trying to do is put a death nail in the coffin of conditional Christianity. In fact, that's the final next step I want you to consider this morning if you are already a believer. Put a nail in the coffin of conditional Christianity by filling out this profession of faith. You'll see it on screen. It's also on your message notes. God, I know you can deliver me from blank. God, I know you can deliver me from loneliness. I know you can deliver me from financial hardship. I know you can deliver me from physical pain. I know you can deliver me from, again, you fill in the blank. And then say, but even if you don't, God, I will not bow to any idol, even if it leads to what feels like a fiery furnace. The next step for some of us today is to put a nail in the coffin of this conditional Christianity so that we are resolved to follow Jesus, even if it leads to what feels like a fiery furnace. Because even if that fiery furnace is painful, we're going to be okay because Jesus is there with us. In fact, more than okay, we will be transformed through what happens in that furnace because it's in that furnace that he's going to be refining us for the glory that's to come. So take a moment right now and maybe even into our closing song, take a moment to fill in the blanks on that profession of faith, putting a nail in the coffin of conditional Christianity. And then here's what I want you to do later today or maybe this next week. I want to encourage you to share your profession of faith with someone else. To declare it out loud to someone else, to name that thing that you're not going to bow down to. And then tell a friend, tell a small group leader, tell maybe someone from our prayer team after the service, someone who would love to pray for you about this. Again, maybe that thing you're tempted to bow to is comfort. Maybe it's security, maybe it's family, maybe it's a political candidate. Maybe it's money or a particular plan for your future. Maybe it's a relational dream. Maybe it's your vocation. Maybe it's your reputation. Maybe it's others' affirmation. Maybe it's something else altogether. But let's get specific this morning about that place where we want God to come through for us in a specific way. But then let's also get specific about how we're going to trust and obey God even if he doesn't. So let's just spend a couple of moments right now responding to God's word, however we need to, knowing that as painful as those flames of the fire furnace might get, we're going to be okay because Jesus is with us in that fire. Father, thank you for all that you've done for us through Christ. Hallelujah. Thank you for what he was willing to endure for us in our place, on our behalf, to deliver us from eternal wrath. and to make us heirs in your kingdom, sons and daughters in your family. Lord, drill that good news deep into our hearts. And then teach us too that you're with us in the fire, that whatever we're going through, you care enough about us to join us there by your Spirit, Lord, so that it absolutely revolutionizes the way we see the situation and respond to it. Lord, we cannot do this with white-knuckled effort. We cannot do this with gritted teeth. Maybe we can, but it doesn't last and it doesn't exhibit joy or trust. We need your Spirit to do this work in us so that we respond this way. So do what only you can do so that you get the glory and we become more and more the people you saved us to be. In Jesus' name, and everyone agreed and said, amen. Let's worship him now.